Just let me know when to begin. Let's open with a word of prayer. Holy God, we want to thank you. For many of us, this is the Holy Sabbath. And as we worship you this day, in formal prayer, in study, and meditation of your character, I pray that each of us will be renewed and refreshed. That our time with you might be a blessing. We thank you for the privilege of the light that you have given to us. In bringing us out of the world and into this glorious movement. You have promised us that the truth will set us free. May this be our prayer today. That we would truly experience freedom. In Jesus' name, amen. I want to welcome everybody. We have two presentations today. I want to begin by looking at a few questions. Some I'll attempt to answer, some I will not. Since September last year, we've been discussing our relationship to the group of people that we call the Levites. And that line of discussion has opened up many questions for people. And even though there are various questions that people have, many of them center around the following theme. What is my role in life? What is my purpose? People are beginning to re-question what they are doing here on earth. Which seems to me either that people never knew what their purpose was, or that people believe they've got some new purpose that they're not sure of. A recurring theme that I've brought up time and again over the years my translator keeps on cutting out. I don't know if it's a problem with my end or their end. I just want to point that out.
Their end.
Okay, so I'll carry on. One of the themes that I have discussed over and over again is the subject of personal salvation. Some people might call it sanctification. And I've approached this subject in various ways, from different perspectives. Some of them center around what people call practical Christianity. But it's always been grounded on a prophetic platform. So a term that was coined as part of those studies a term called the 7 steps of salvation. That term, that title was born out of this conversation, this idea of personal salvation. And so what I've done over the years, and I continue to do, is to discuss the plan of salvation from different perspectives, specifically 2 perspectives. From the perspective of the individual and what we might call from the perspective of the group. This idea of the group has got different terms, each with a slightly different nuance. So some people might call it the great controversy. Sometimes the term institution is used. Sometimes the term the church is used. And when you go to the Bible, there are many symbols that are portrayed to talk about this group phenomena. At a very simple level, it's not complicated to distinguish or separate between the individual and the group. Sometimes we become confused in our modeling. And sometimes those models apply to both the individual and the group. In your studies, in your meditations, as far as you're able to, you must distinguish between the individual work and the corporate work. This has come into sharp focus as we have been discussing the subject of the Levites. in more recent studies, I've continued this idea of sanctification, of personal salvation. And discussed again the subject of prayer. And this subject of prayer has raised many questions, as it always has in the past. And if I can put it this way, the cry of the people is, we don't know how to pray. And even though this may appear to be a new question, it's not. The question that's arisen in the minds of people many times over the years. But the reason why it's come back into focus perhaps people might think in a new way, is because I think for the first time in this movement, the subject of how we deal with what we might call Eastern mysticism, Some people might call it yoga. And people are not sure if they can practice these, we'll call them these arts, or are they in conflict with our Christian faith? There's another term that's used commonly nowadays. It's called mindfulness. And as I mentioned previously, the word or the term mindfulness is just a medical term for basically meditation or yoga. Those terms were too religious, too quirky for the medical fraternity. So early proponents chose a different term, which was mindfulness. Okay, I wasn't sure when my translator had finished because they keep cutting out. That's why there was a pause. So today, when you hear the term mindfulness, it's a sanitized, medicalized word that really just means meditation, yoga, or Eastern mysticism. And when the question was asked about practicing some of those things, I tried to address the subject, hopefully in a intelligent and sympathetic way. Without focusing upon the God that you're worshipping, or the system of religion, what I chose to do was to try to look at what the essence that people who practice these things were trying to achieve. And the reason I wanted to do that was not to promote those practices. Neither was my purpose to disparage them or trash them. Speak bad about them. My purpose was to show what's lacking in our spiritual experience, in our prayer life. And so that's raised this question once again. People don't know how to pray. So I'm not going to address those questions about prayer specifically here. But I do want to clarify some points. I'm neither disparaging, which means speaking bad. I'm not neither disparaging or promoting mindfulness. And I'm not saying it's wrong to have, I'm going to use the term formal prayer. Some people might call it ritualistic prayer. Because those people who promote mindfulness or yoga, they are very ritualistic in their practices. So I don't want to make it appear that I'm opposed to formal prayer. If you ask yogic experts, yogis, they won't use this term, but it's a term that we use as Christians. A life of prayer. So it's a term that you're all familiar with, that we should have a life of prayer. We should be in constant communication with God. So simply that would mean that your existence, your being would be communicating with God 24/7. As soon as you start viewing that phrase, a life of prayer, in that way, it needs to be contextualized. Now, yogics will have a very similar idea. That a person should be mindful, or they should meditate all the time. And while sleep is a complex subject, the time that we're awake affects the time that we're asleep, and vice versa. So there is a truthfulness to the idea of having a prayer life 24/7, even through sleep. those yogics, like me, are clear on one thing. Even though they speak about having a mindful life, they speak about the importance of setting aside time in the day specifically for meditation. And we, above all the people of the earth, should be able to have empathy with that idea. Because that's the essence of the Sabbath. That's the essence of tithe. We don't return our tithe, we give to God God's tithe. And so we're all familiar with the idea and the logic about Sabbath. This is, we might call it holy time or special time. So I'm not saying there's anything wrong with formal prayer, that you pray at the beginning of a meal, you pray when you wake up, you pray when you go to sleep. There's a place for all of those things. What's lacking is this idea of having deep and meaningful communication with God. And so I wanted to clarify that point, or those couple of points. So people are asking, how do they pray? So the one thing I want to say is there are some techniques that we could use that are helpful, but there are no rules. And one thing that I haven't discussed is the connection between breathing and mindfulness. People are fearful about breathing techniques. But once again, the science is really strong about the benefits of proper breathing. And again, I think it's something that we as Adventists have confined to the health message or the reform message. And have separated that from our spiritual life. And I think part of the reason for that is many of us have separated the reforms from our spiritual life. We've compartmentalized those things. So a question that's come up a few times with people is the subject of time setting. People want to know the time of the Sunday law and why we're not time setting. I think one of the things that we still haven't understood or learned our lesson from is the weakness or the inability of time setting to produce nothing more than emotional excitement. So that's one point. The second point is people want to know when the Sunday law is. And the problem with pursuing that avenue of investigation is that the way inspiration speaks about the Sunday law can deceive you into thinking that that's a big event. And we have enough collective information now that we know it will not be a major event. Approaching 2014, the Sunday law, there was opposition to that. Post 2014, when there was an acceptance that that study, that idea was truth, that using the 25/20 as a key to unlock time, that 2014 could be demonstrated as the Sunday law. It took us years to actually figure out what even happened in 2014, what the Sunday law was. And people had some really strange ideas. And the reason why they were strange is because they had been warped by people's political leaning. And their social conditioning. This movement was run and controlled by conservative Americans. This was not just FFA. This American conservative viewpoint was shaping, molding, and had warped this movement's view of what truth was, of what the Sunday law was. And what those Americans had done was to put their personal prejudices and filter them into their prophetic message. In 2018, Elder Jeff correctly understood one thing, that he must decrease and others must increase. And when I say he, I don't just mean him as an individual. I mean American conservatism. In the movement. And what ended up happening was that God raised up another leader from a different continent someone who had been brought up with a completely different political view of how the world is constructed. And what we began to do in this movement was deconstruct American hegemony. So hegemony means basically control, simply put. We began to realize that this is a worldwide movement with a worldwide message. It's multilingual, multilingual and multicultural and multi-religion. And so the idea of actually a literal Sunday law soon was discarded as a historical idea. Because it could not fit into a worldwide message. And that's why we've clearly understood now what the test is. And one of the things that came to light was that in 2014, there was not a singular event, there was a cluster of events. So my point is this. If I were to give you the date of the Sunday law, it would not help you. It might get you excited, either happy or fearful, one of those two emotions, but it won't do much more than that. Because the next thing that people will ask, if I gave you the date, is what is the Sunday law going to be? And whilst I might know the date, I definitely don't know the event. Or more accurately, the cluster of events. All we have is the general theme. But what I can tell you is that we don't have much time left. So part of this question is the movement today failing like the Millerites failed? From the very top, the Millerites rejected the methodology and the necessary tools to calculate time. And that failure brought them into a Laodicean condition, simply stated. And therefore they were unprepared for the Sunday law in their time, if I can phrase it that way. The question is, are we making a similar mistake? When people ask a question like this, it's not normally a question, it's normally a suggestion. I don't believe we are. I don't believe we're making the same mistakes as the Millerites made. Our reliance upon time will not help us. And I think I've already given sufficient information, clues, if you like, about how to determine the nature and the timing of the Sunday law. It's connected to the election cycle in the United States. And the transfer of power between the Democrats and the Republicans. That's all the clues that we need. But the waymark that's of significance for us and I'm not saying this, inspiration teaches it. Revelation 18 is not the Sunday law. It's the loud cry. Sometimes people call it the midnight cry. If you put those glasses on and go back and read inspiration, you'll see that that's the constant theme where Ellen White focuses her attention. It's upon the loud cry, not upon the Sunday law. And I definitely don't know the date for the loud cry. Okay, so another question, it's more of a theme, is about bad journalism. I've used the word bad. Weak journalism, some might say. And the reason why I think this is an important question is because I've stated many times before that there are degrees of inspiration, which means that there are degrees of prophets, different types of prophets. And I've said unequivocally that I believe that journalists are prophets. They don't have the same nature or quality as we possess. But they are prophets. I want to make an observation now. Oh no, let me go with the question first. So there are various examples that are given in this question about journalism. I think I'll go with 3. One of them is mask wearing. One of them is the bombing of the Nord Stream pipeline. I hope you all know what that is. That was a gas pipeline that that went from Russia to Europe. It was called Nord Stream 2 because it was the second pipeline. And it got bombed recently, last year sometime. And the third example about evangelism the question didn't say this, but I'm going to say it, bad journalism was about the source of the COVID virus. Where did it come from? So if you've kept up with the news, you know the three examples that I've spoken of. In fact, the first example about masks, I even posted some information on the media broadcast recently. So the point that's being brought up here is that these journalists change their minds, which means that either they make a mistake and they give you bad information, and then they give you good information, or it's vice versa. We would hope it goes from bad to good as light progresses. Which you all know leads to the question, how can you trust people who make mistakes? And I think the reason why this is a really important question is not because it's about should we wear masks or should we not. It goes down to the fact of how do we view prophets and their work? Can prophets make mistakes? Do they make mistakes? Do they have prejudices? Do they have a warped understanding of the truth? All of those questions were already answered long before any of those three news events happened. There are an important set of studies that were done in France, and I'm going to go with 2018. I might have the year wrong. And what those studies focused on in preparation of this question was tackling the subject of the failure of prophets. And I think good evidence was given, compelling evidence, that William Miller was a bad prophet. And I think many of us could empathize with that view. But what was more challenging for people who had looked at those studies was the idea, what kind of prophet was Ellen White? And those studies gave a good defense discussing the idea that Ellen White was a bad prophet. So the question is, when we talk about good and bad, what does that mean? Because it has to have a context. We're all familiar with the churches. Spoken about in Revelation 2 and 3. So I spoke about William Miller and I spoke about Ellen White. And we know that they, if I can phrase it this way, loosely, that they are the messengers to the church. You know that Ellen White speaks of herself in that framework. So I want to go from a messenger to the church of their time to the angel of the church of their time. With Revelation 3:1, Revelation 3:14. Revelation 3:1. Speaking about the church of Sardis. Revelation 3:14, speaking about the church of Laodicea. Look at those two churches and lay them side by side and compare them. And they both had the same characteristic. They both claim to be alive, but they're dead. And when it speaks about life, this is talking about life in and of themselves, and they have a life-saving message. So it's not just about themselves, it's also about the message that they have. They claim to have a message of life, of salvation, but they brought a message that they gave a message that brought death. Because as a person speaks, it's how they think. Whatever you think, you act out. So even though they claim to have a message of life, of salvation, their message brings death. And in and of themselves, they claim to have life, salvation, but they are dead. It's all about profession. But their works don't follow through. And those works have to be considered personally, which is the individual, what they think, and corporately, the message that they're going to give. So when we talk about the works, it's their personal experience and the message that they're going to give, their prophetic model. And both these prophets make mistakes, big ones. They have truth. They're messengers from God. But their message is so damaged because of their personal experience. Instead of bringing life, it brings death. This is not something new. As I said, these studies were done years ago. So the point I want to make is that when we think about prophets, we have to be nuanced. We have to be realistic about the difference between humanity and divinity. And how they combine, how they join together. And part of those studies and others that have been done since then discuss the weakness of God. God's frailty. And God's weakness and God's frailty is the following. The same problem we all have. It's our need for relationships. Because relationships always will tend to weaken you. It will weaken your ability to behave and act in the way that you know to be correct. We often call it compromise. And that is not the entirety of it, but that's part of God's weakness. God chooses, can't choose, is forced by God's nature to have relationships. And that weakens God's ability to do things right. So God's going to choose weak human beings. People who are broken and have a wrong idea of the truth. And they have to go to an education process as they're doing their work. And it's a disastrous combination. It will always lead to pain and heartache for both partners, God and the prophet. and all the people that the prophet is communicating with. So I want to reiterate the point. Prophets have a consistent history of doing a bad job. Misrepresenting God and making mistakes. Doing their agenda, not God's agenda. But what we must remember is that it's not malicious, it's not premeditated. The frailty of human beings. So when it comes to the truths in this movement, one of the things that we need to be careful about, and I hear this all the time, what is the movement's position on subject X? And my first question always is, who's the movement that you're referring to? Are you talking about one person, or are you talking about we had some kind of vote on it? And the movement's position is what the majority voted on. You know that's never the case. So when we talk about the movement position, we all know what that means. And it exposes people to great danger. Because the movement's position in 1840 was that God was going to come back to earth in 3 years. Now, that wasn't some 300 Millerite preachers coming up with that idea. The movement's position was Miller's position. And go to 1863. We can blame the leaders for trashing, throwing away the 2520. But everybody knows who was running the church. It's Ellen White. And Ellen White does not argue against that. She rubber stamps it. So when we talk about the position of the 2520 and we want to blame certain individuals in the church, in English, they use the term, the buck stops with the boss. It means the final responsibility goes to Ellen White. So when we speak about a movement position, we tend to mean it's the statement or the position of the messenger or the angel of the church. And that has strengths and weaknesses to it. So bear that in mind. Coming back to journalism, we have become, what I want to say is, careless, if not lazy, in our language. We talk about good news and bad news. The news that's on the left or the news that's on the right. What news is safe and what news is dangerous. But it seems to me we aren't using that term accurately. I think when we talk about good and bad news or news bias, what we're not speaking about really is the news. What we're really speaking about is people's opinions. I would like you to consider the following. The news are or is facts. The thing that actually happened. And what we tend to call news actually isn't news. It's people's or journalists' opinions on a subject. Now, I'm not arguing, because I've already made this point, that prophets bring in their prejudices, their biases into their message. They do that. But I think it's helpful if we keep clear in our mind the difference between the news, which is the facts, and the opinions, which is based upon people's biases or people's worldview. Our work is not to investigate or to comment. No, it's not to investigate the news. When we postulate between what is a good source or a bad source. If everybody was unbiased, they would just give the facts. Now, like yourselves, I know that that is a naive view of how the world operates. Because the choice of words that I will use to explain the news tends to bring in my biases. So instead of saying there was a sunrise, which is news because it's just a fact, what journalists, what prophets tend to do they tend to want to give their view on what that sunrise looked like, felt like, what it meant. And that's where we get media bias. A large proportion of all the articles that we share on our forums if you look carefully, you'll see that they're opinion pieces. They're not even news. And the other half of the articles that we share are news. But what tends to happen is that instead of just giving the facts, "20 people were killed," a journalist will say 20 people were killed by angry-looking policemen. And another journalist will say 20 people were killed by faithful, hard-working policemen. So you need to be able to see the difference between the news and those two opinions. So when we approach news, we need to be really careful about distilling the facts from opinions. I say be careful about it, but you can't succeed. You will always fail. Because what you need to then factor in is another element to this. It's your personal biases and your personal prejudices. Because you had a bad experience with police, so which journalists are you going to trust more? Or your wife is a police woman, and you trust your wife and you know what she's like, and therefore you will have another perspective of what that event was and how it happened. So when you combine all of these elements to the message, to journalism, however you want to frame the issue, there are certain things that you need to distill from all of this. One of them is that there are facts, there is news. And that is different to opinions. And you need both. You need facts and you need opinions. Because when I read something in the news, I want that person's opinion of what happened as much as I want the facts. The stock market went down 2% yesterday. That's the fact. I want to know that. But what else do I want to know? What's the implications of this? Why did it happen? And where's it going? Where's it headed? And that is not news. That is now opinion. And because I've got a vested interest in this, and I've got my own prejudices or my own views of how things are supposed to work, I will seek out journalists or articles that are in agreement with my worldview. And you must all see how naive, stupid, and dangerous that is. It's called confirmation bias. I have a bias and I just want someone to confirm it. I think the stock market is going up. So when it dropped 2% yesterday, that's just a temporary correction. It's not the beginning of a bear market, because I don't want to have a bear market. And this is how we approach prophecy. There's failure and mistakes all around. There's plenty of blame for everybody. You can blame the messenger. You can blame the flock. Blame God. You can blame Satan. There's blame everywhere. Because people have got their own biases, their own agendas, their own views. So, if I believe this is the facts, this is the news, this is the truth, what am I supposed to do with that? Do I share the truth? Or do I not share it? And the problem is the following. When it comes to the movement's news, part of what we're doing is not just talking about the news, which is what's actually happening. We want to talk about the news of what's happening tomorrow, and that's not news yet. Prophecy is an extrapolation or an extension of the news. Cause to effect. I know the Sunday law is coming because that's not news. That was a bad sentence. It might get translated wrong. I know the Sunday law is coming, even though that is not news. I know it's coming because there is news, which means it's happening right now. Alan White calls that the agitation of the Sunday law. And I think we need to always bear that in mind, that a future prediction has to be based upon a present experience. Otherwise, numerology would send you mad. So I could calculate the Sunday law coming 20 different times and give you 20 different dates. When it came to the Millerite movement, the only way that was working the only way that the prediction of 1843 is happening is, we call it, there's a loud cry, which really is news that's happening today in 1840. That's today. And the problem is, you've got to be able to decide or decipher what that news means. So John Smith says that news in the Middle East means nothing. The movement said that event in the Middle East means the second advent is in 3 years, simply put. So I want us to see this is a really complicated issue. So I gave you 3 examples. Mask wearing, the bombing of the pipeline, and where did COVID come from? And if you trace the news of all of those 3 issues, no one knows all the facts at the beginning. In the middle, and even today, we can't say that we're at the end. And so even now, we don't know all the facts of any of those 3 things. The closest one that we can get to is on mask wearing. But the problem with that is, if you look at the research that's done on mask wearing, it's complicated. And everybody wants a simple message. And what people assume at the beginning ends up changing or evolving as new information comes along. So the subject of mask wearing, it shouldn't come as a surprise that the recommendation changes. You need to remember that, why are people wearing masks? It's to stop viruses entering into your system. So therefore, you need to understand how the viruses enter. And this is not complete, so I'm going to say it simply. The viruses piggy bank or are carried on moisture, or we'll call it water droplets. And those water molecules are of different sizes. They could be droplets or they could be vapor. The difference between rain and fog. You don't say that it's raining, you don't say that it's pouring fog, because fog will remain stationary. Because it's about particle size. And viruses can sit on small pieces of water and larger pieces of water. So when it comes to the viruses entering into your body, they're going to come in 2 ways. on big water particles and on small water particles. And masks will only help you with viruses that are on big water particles. And the way they help the most is not from helping the victim, but it's helping the perpetrator. It's to stop the water particles in the person who's got the virus spreading to other people. It's to contain their water particles. And if someone doesn't wear a mask and they sneeze in front of you, the mask can help stop the bigger water particles as well, of course. So masks do nothing for small water vapor, small water molecules. The way to tackle that is through ventilation. Which is a completely different protective mechanism than mask wearing. So the whole subject of mask wearing is complicated, to put it mildly. So the facts are, mask will help a little bit. And then it becomes to opinions and biases. How do we approach the subject of masks? And that's why you get this ebbing and flowing of different information of mask, good or bad. The pipeline that got bombed. Who's against the pipeline? They must be the perpetrators. The problem is there are plenty of people against the pipeline. The Russians, the Americans, the Europeans, the Ukrainians. There's 4. And we'll throw in the Chinese for good measure. So I will assume it's the Russians. But I don't have any facts. That's not news. So as more evidence comes to light, the story will change. So you need to ask yourself a question. What do you do with the news now? Do you throw it away and say, well, it always changes, you just can't trust these people, it's a waste of my time? Because this is the very same question that you need to ask of yourself when it comes to your relationship to the movement, to the message. Does the message change? Yes. Is light progressive? Yes. Do mistakes happen? Yes. The 2 examples I gave was Miller and White. If you don't go back to that foundation, it becomes all too easy to attack Elder Jeff or Elder Tess. and me, if you like. So human beings are learning. The prophets of God are learning. If you're not willing to accept that, I don't know what hope there is for you. I don't know how you view yourselves, if you consider yourself a Seventh-day Adventist and what that actually means to you. But all of us see that we have taken those truths of Adventism and we have modified and changed them as new light has come. When this movement began, the members who had joined considered themselves as Adventist. But they said that Adventism was teaching error. And the movement had the truth. I agree with all of that. But truth is never static, it continues. Why is this so important? I've discussed the subject of journalism. And I've tried to connect how we approach journalism to how we approach prophecy. I've tried to show the difference between news and opinion. I've tried to show that everybody has a bias, even you and me. And all of these things feed into a wider problem that we have. There's a balancing act that we have to all participate in. You've seen these statues of the God of justice. And often they hold a scale or a balance in their hand as they balance the information, the facts, to make a decision. And you'll see that often those statues are blindfolded. Which is a joke. Because it's meant to portray that that justice is unbiased, and we know it never is. So you and I need to be careful, and we need to be balanced. And the balance is this. Do we believe in the prophets that God has sent to us? You might call them the angels. So the simple answer, I guess, would be yes. So whilst holding on to that truth for yourself, that belief, are you willing to also hold another concept? That those prophets can be making mistakes and have taught things that are incorrect or partially incorrect. Now, I'm not setting you up for something, like I'm going to dump some news on you. That's not what I'm trying to do. But combined with this question on journalism and how we approach it, we have to have confidence in good journalism. But we have to acknowledge that the news develops, it changes as new information comes to light. The good thing, not a bad thing, that the news develops, it gets refined. I'm happy as I see the news changing and developing through time on any particular subject. People have asked the question, what's all this stuff about the Levites? Why is it such a big issue? One of the reasons it's a big issue is because we're living in the dispensation of the Levites, if I can say it that way. But already nothing looks like we imagined it was going to look like. So that has to bring you to your knees in prayer and to question the models that you have been using. And that's what I've been trying to do in discussing the Levites. And I am surprised that people are worried about being challenged. The first thing people ask is, does that mean we made a mistake? And I don't know why people approach it that way. Because for me, it just seems a glorious manifestation of the revelation of truth. I'm positive about change. I'm not negative about it. So what's going to happen, and it's already begun, when it comes to the subject of the Levites, Revelation 7 and the 144,000, and who's going to live and who's going to die. And is there going to be mass execution at the close of probation? And who's special and who isn't? Who's going to get translated and who isn't? All of these things are now being challenged because we see that the model that we have about the Levites already is not fit for purpose. Today, which is the news. The news is the Levites aren't coming in. People don't like it when I say that. So I'll just say lots of Levites aren't coming in. So then we all have our biases and our opinions. But based upon today's news, we make predictions. And we've all predicted about the Levites and the Nethinims. And if the news today looks different, what does that mean for the prophecy in the future? You might view this in the following way. They made a mistake about the priests, Levites, and Nethinims. We can't trust these people. They don't know what they're talking about. That's based upon your opinion or your bias. Or you can have another bias. I've gone through this, not me, but I'm speaking of you. I've gone through this many times before. The light grows. Truth develops. What I thought was correct before, the idea, gets changed and modified. Me, perhaps not like you, have never been concerned about going from one prophet to another prophet. I see it as a continuum. I don't view it that Elder Tess has corrected Elder Jeff's mistake. Because Elder Jeff, if he had stayed long enough, could potentially have corrected his own mistakes. So if we feel comfortable with that idea, that we can self-correct, that we don't need to throw people away because they said something wrong, none of you throw Ellen White away, and she did plenty of things wrong. But you intelligently understand and explain it. So when it comes to the subject of the Levites and their role in end-time prophecy, are they part of the 144,000? Will they die? How is the death going to work? Will they be translated? How does that work? If you're like me, you'll allow the truth to explain things to you. You'll bring your past experiences with you, but they won't shackle you. Because if you allow the past to shackle you, you'll continue to believe a lie and you will die. So I'm willing to discuss, explore, and research what the future looks like. Based upon a re-examination of inspiration and based upon the news. When I say news, in this context, it's not the newspapers. It's the facts of what's happening, not why it's happening. Levites aren't coming in, that's a fact. We could argue they're going to come in tomorrow. We could argue that we've got our dates wrong. There are plenty of arguments, which are all opinions, but we know what the fact is. If our framework is correct, I believe that it is, then we're in the time of the Levites, they're not coming in. So our view of what we in the past called prophecy, but today we call news, was wrong. And based upon today's news and my bias, my prejudice, that the framework is correct, that I believe and trust in the truth that Elder Jeff and Elder Tess have taught, I'm willing personally to explore what the future of the Levites looks like. And if it changes, it really does not trouble me or worry me. If it doesn't change, that's good. But I've got enough experience to know that, I will just say it this way, it will change. Our parabolic view of end time prophecy is childish and immature. And it will look different to what each of us believes or have believed. Don't be fearful of change. Don't be fearful of the development of truth. And accept the frailty of humanity, particularly the humanity of the angels, as well as your own frailties. Let's pray. Holy God, we thank you. As we discuss the questions and the thoughts that are troubling us, I thank you that you are mindful of our frailty and you are sympathetic. I thank you for the mercy that you show upon me and each of us. I would ask that you would bless us and you would help us to be mindful of our biases, of our prejudices, and that you would help us to be honest, intellectually honest. And rather than seeing change as something dangerous and to be pushed aside, that we would see that the development and the changing truth to be a revelation of yourself. May each of us continue to be faithful and true. We ask in Jesus' name. Amen. Thank you, everybody. And we'll meet later in the day, whenever that day is for you.